Decentralized Grid. Alex Moody and I will be your hosts today. And as many of you are aware, Pantokrator has been supporting the energy transition as an investment bank based in London for the last 16 years. Today's webinar on the decentralized grid is the third in our series on the Grid 2.0. Previous webinars examined smartening the grid with innovative software and also how do we build resilience in the grid, which of course is critical. How do you upgrade the grid while the load is doubling? And those are just, a couple of sort of points that we wanted to kind of raise in today's webinar. If you look at it from the macro, electricity demand is going to grow by 2 to 3 times in the next 25 years, and largely, as we all know, driven by e-mobility, industrial heating, and of course, data centers. And whilst this has prompted the biggest grid build out in the last decade, the grid was designed for peak demand, and hence, on average basis, we have significant available capacity. And the analogy I like to use is, looking at highways at rush hour versus 3 a.m. So creating flexible demand and storage are going to be key solutions that we'll explore. There's approximately $1 billion a day that's being invested in decentralized grid solutions, and this is likely to climb 3 times over the next 10 years. New entrants have also raised $800 million in venture money in the last several years, and we think this is likely to increase. So to take a deeper look, I'd love to introduce Alex to take us through the slides on the decentralized grid. Thank you, Alex.
Perfect, and thank you too. So I guess to kick things off, what is a decentralized grid? There's a variety of different definitions, but the one we'll use today is a network of local DERs, distributed energy resources, where you can generate and store energy at the point of use. So the way to think of a grid is you can split into 2 buckets, front of the meter and behind the meter. Front of the meter, traditionally utility focused, is effectively sole grid focus around decentralized control and small scale generation in this case. Whilst behind the meter, traditionally consumer end user oriented, now actually is having to balance in grid responsibilities as the line continues to blur, especially as you have players such as data centers increasingly getting involved on the generation front. So going ahead, what kind of solutions are needed? Well, the first one to tackle is storage, which is set to quadruple over the coming years. The key thing here to note is that there's actually multiple different technologies and applications being tackled, so there's a wide variety of opportunities available to explore. Going deeper into the actual power and demand side, looking at data centers, their power consumption is set to skyrocket as well, in line with growth of AI. But the challenge here is that the grid's been struggling to keep up, where you can actually have to wait up to a decade to get a grid connection. Now, the opportunity is too valuable to pass up, though, so data centers are looking at a way to bypass this constraint. So one of the ways that they're doing this is to just bring their own power. A 100 megawatt data center costs about $5 billion to produce, but only about 500 million of which is to provide your own power, so relatively cheap. The interesting thing is that hyperscalers are also coalescing towards the idea of small distributed data centers focused on AI inference instead of the traditional gigawatt scale campuses, meaning there's going to be more and more of this kind of scope going ahead. But overall, for a data center, it's not just so simple as putting down some power. They're actually having to build out their own complex ecosystems, meaning they're having to think much more like utilities, and they need a new set of skill sets and opportunities to overcome this challenge. Going into what is decentralization enabling overall, if you think from a historical point of view, the grid was relatively passive. Power would be produced, distributed, transmitted down to end users and consumed. The consumers nowadays are actually themselves microgrids, where you can think of them as nodes where power is generated, stored, and consumed all at the point of use. But to enable this more modern dynamic grid, you need a new set of tools to actually enable this transition. And that's what we have here. So we've taken a snapshot across the space of all the different kind of complementary approaches that can enable this, highlighting out our wonderful panelists who will be sharing their approaches shortly. The key thing to take away from this is it's not just one player that's going to take it all. Instead, it's actually a fairly complex market where you need all these different players working together to fully unlock the grid. And investors have been recognizing this opportunity too. So over 800 million has been invested over the last 3 years. It's not just financials, but there's been a big role being played by strategics as well, as they get involved increasingly in the space, including even some acquisitions as well. Now on to Andre with some of our key takeaways. Oh, Andre, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, a number of very important themes have arisen. And just to name a few, energy is becoming a strategic capability. It's something we took for granted, but it's now the limiting factor in developing superintelligence. And utilities are now at the top table. That's quite a change. Also, hyperscalers are contributing to the solution as well, and they're going to be part of the solution. So that's going to change the kind of cultural makeup of our energy system. The barrier between behind the meter and in front of the meter is blurring, with end users starting to think like mini utilities. There's also much to be gained in the very short term by using all the spare capacity we've talked about in the grid, and this is spurring innovation in the T&D sectors. We also see minimizing supply chain risk as a key theme, in worlds of transformers, supercapacitors, and rare earths. So there's lots to cover, and I hope we can touch on that as we get into our discussion. But first, I'd love to introduce you to our panel today. And first, we welcome Haroon from DG Matrix. DG Matrix is a solid-state transformer pioneer, intelligently aggregating power from multiple sources to enable AI. We also have Matthew from IONATE, which is a hybrid intelligent transformer, upgrading legacy units from solid-state standards to meet modern grid and DC needs. We also welcome Julian from Skeleton Technologies, which is the next gen in supercapacitors and super batteries, and it enables mission-critical power for both grid stability and data centers. And finally, a big welcome to Pier from Sparkfund. It's a distributed storage startup leveraging distributed capacity procurement model with utilities to rapidly deploy distributed energy resources. So thank you all for joining us. And may I first invite Haroon, please share with us some of a brief intro on DG Matrix.
Thank you very much. DG Matrix is creating the new power fabric for behind the meter energy aggregation for AI data centers. Today, we are about 350 plus engineers with 24 PhDs. Our deployments have been live since April 2024, and we're putting in multi-gigawatt capacity for delivery in 2027. Our initial round of 20 million seed was led by Clean Energy Ventures with ABB, Chevron, and Cerberus, a large private equity firm participating. Our A round was closed this February with MIT's Engine Ventures, with participation from all seed investors, as well as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and the Fidelity Investments venture arm. So very significant capital is backing us up. And we are in a very good partnership with NVIDIA to develop their 800-volt architecture. What we do is we have a multi-port solid-state transformer, unlike anybody else. And in this multi-port, we can take each port and connect it either to an energy source, a storage source, or we can connect it to a load, AC or DC. So think of it as a traffic circle into which multiple roads are coming. We can direct traffic, which is the power, in and out of every road at will. And we do it in millions of seconds. So we can combine any percentage of utility, battery, AC generator, and route it to the right AC or DC power. What it's doing is, with the significant simplicity we're bringing, it's a much faster time to market, and that means much faster time to compute and revenue. It is also future-proofing because it's one single solution that's tightly integrated, software-defined. The resiliency of this solution, because we can parallel multiple interports together, we will likely be the first company in the world to take data centers from 5 nines of reliability to 6 nines of reliability. And finally, because of our built-in energy management system, we are We have built an energy management system that runs in the millions of seconds to lower your cost of energy, transient and steady state. There are many data center architectures. We can simplify any of those when you add in behind the meter power. Shown on the left-hand side is one such manifestation with grid power coming in from the top, battery storage coming in from the left, and any form of AC or DC generation like fuel cells coming in from the bottom. All the equipment that is in red, DG Matrix takes out and does native combination right there to have a far simpler supply chain and a far simpler cost structure and maintenance structure. In physical form, there are two skids in this example. Each skid is 30 feet by 4 feet. Those two skids on either side, plus two large transformers, that's what we displace in a 4 foot by 4 foot unit that's shown here. This has been tested and deployed since July of 2025, and we are signing up very large scale integrators to take the solution global. That's it. There are also skidded options where we combine multiple units in 3 MVA power or to 5 MVA power. That's the new skid that then gets deployed right outside the data center. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Haroon. That's excellent. Excellent, Haroon. May I turn now to Matthew to introduce us to IONATE? Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, guys. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Matthew from IONATE. We have a new hardware software backbone for the smart grid. Alex and Andre had quickly taken us through some stuff at the high level on the grid, but I think most people understand when we look at the power system, there's different areas of it. We have to generate power, we have to move it around, we use it, whether that's in data centers or industrials or in the home. And there's a whole range of different types of hardware technologies that are used to achieve this. But we also have this software stack on top of it. The hardware alone in the past has been fantastic at delivering us a reliable, affordable energy system. But as we've added all this complexity, both on the generation and the consumption side, we need more hardware technology. And we end up with this stack of software on top as well. And the only way to get an efficient, reliable system is for all of this to integrate correctly. So we need interoperability between everything, but we also need proper integration from the hardware through the software as a full stack approach. And this is really what IONATE is looking at. So if we look at our hardware, we have a hybrid intelligent transformer, or HIT. So it's a drop-in replacement for a traditional transformer. It looks and connects exactly the same way, meets all of the same IEC, IEEE, ANSI standards, but we've added a brain. And this gives us two things. Because it's real-time visibility, so you can see power flows. That's really important and is not always available today. But it also gives us millisecond precision power flow control. So we do everything from voltage, harmonics, reactive power. I don't know how many engineering nerds like me are on the call, but essentially everything you care about in the power system, we do in a single device. We're going in with 4 customer segments. So data center, of course, is one. There it's all around energy efficiency and power quality, both to the racks, to the IT load, but also the cooling and everything else as well. Similarly, we work with industrials. So it's a very, very similar case there. You want high quality power, avoiding plant trips, improving energy efficiency, bringing down your OPEX. We also work with renewables and BESS. Again, here, a lot of it is around improving your asset or your project productivity. But perhaps most interesting for today is around the utility or the DSO. So within grids, they've been fantastic for a very long time, but unfortunately, we're adding all of these things. And DERs is a big pain point, particularly at the grid edge for the distribution utility. They care about efficiency, they care about asset utilization, how much can they connect without needing to dig up roads and lay new cables. But more and more, one of the biggest challenges facing them, particularly at the grid edge, is visibility and voltage control. So across Europe, this is now the #1 concern from most utilities, and is exactly one of the problems that IONATE helps resolve for them. So once our hit is within a network, it solves all the problems in the physics for them. Our Aurora software platform sits over the top. So it gives you visualization. You can go down to seeing waveforms of power in real time. It gives you analytics, fleet management, all the things that you would expect. But the key unlock here is because we have this full stack approach from the hardware up to the software, we're able to coordinate devices using a decentralized control approach to unlock flexibility and resiliency. We've had independent power system studies done showing that instead of using transformers, if you use HITs or advanced power flow control, on average, you can get 33% more DERs connected, but you can also get 25% more power through the existing infrastructure and a 6% reduction in losses. So this is something that we're working on with the University of Oxford and will start to be rolled out shortly.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me turn now to Julian. Please tell us what you're doing at Skeleton. I hear there's some pretty exciting stuff.
Thanks a lot. Julian, my name. I am the sales director for Skeleton, and we are actually originally an Estonia founded company, but producing in Germany, having there the today largest supercapacitor factory globally in terms of capacitance. But we are actually spread out all over Europe. With France, Finland, and also having first colleagues based in the US, considering this AI data center boom, there is no way around also crossing the Atlantic. We are roughly over 300 people in the company, having really strong investors in the background that help us also to explore the market. We are offering supercapacitors to the market. And there we are owning the entire value chain from raw material production, single cell production. We are building own modules with power electronics. And in there, out of those, we are developing systems and containers for supercapacitors. And that we are deploying globally, having over 15 years of experience, and we are adapting very fast to the market needs. And I will get a bit closer to what our market is. But before that, I will give you a bit of insights for those who haven't heard of supercapacitors yet, what a supercapacitor is. You will probably, or most of you will probably be well aware of lithium-ion batteries that are considered to have really high energy density and deployed globally in a large scale. Supercapacitors, on the other hand, are very complementary to lithium-ion batteries. So they are having a lot of power densities, but very limited energy density. This means you can provide incredibly high power for a very short amount of time. Plus, you have almost unlimited cycle life. And that is when you consider data center and also grid fluctuation, exactly what those power profiles are requesting. And that is why supercapacitor markets are in the last years growing significantly. Even though the technology itself is nothing new, but Skeleton is very active in that area, so that there's a lot of innovation ongoing as well. So the journey started, or the big ramp up started for us in Germany, where you have the Energiewende, so the energy transition, no rotating equipment anymore on the grid, a lot of renewables connected to it, plus a hunger for power. And for that reason, the German TSOs decided to tender for eStatCom, and eStatCom is actually traditional high voltage converter connected to supercapacitors. And now with this AI data center boom in the US, you don't only have this energy transition, but on top the cake gets bigger. So the hunger gets bigger, where you can solve with our graphene GPU product the data center peaks and shave those directly within the white space of the data center. And I think we will get later deeper into those discussions as well. So I look forward to to our roundtable later.
Thank you so much, Julian. That's terrific. And lastly, could I invite Pier? Tell us what you're doing at Sparkfund.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks for having us on the webinar. And Julian, I now want to make a shirt that says the cake gets bigger, so the hunger gets bigger. Sparkfund is all about helping grow the grid faster by filling in the gaps by putting distributed batteries and gensets where the grid needs them most. So our mission is to deliver the distributed grid and, pretty simply put, work with utilities and landowners to find great places to put distributed assets, batteries, and gas gensets, think 1 to 5 megawatts, where the grid needs the most to fill in gaps and grow the grid faster with distributed capacity. So what does that look like? We really believe that what we're doing with these distributed assets is a new utility grade resource class. So these are assets that are large enough to have the quality of telemetry and data that utility operators and dispatchers need to connect fully into their control room with SCADA. So these can be control room operated and dispatched and are, I think, critically 100% dedicated to grid operation. So it defines a distributed capacity procurement and how it would be different than, for example, a behind the meter VPP or other aggregation, is that most behind the meter assets have a split focus between customer value and grid value, which is great. I mean, you're providing value to two parties. But the nuance there is that because of that, kind of dual function, it can be difficult for grid operators to integrate those assets with confidence into system planning and actually count them as persistent infrastructure in the same way that they see investments in transformers and substations and traditional equipment as a way to persistently grow the grid for permanent large load or other growth. So what the point this slide is making is, when you have a transmission and distribution system and you're adding a transmission connected data center, if you have enough data and confidence in the assets you're installing on the distribution system, you actually can accredit those assets almost as sort of through their impact on the substation as clearing space on a high voltage transmission line and unlocking additional true capacity, real megawatts that can be directly accredited to a data center. And I think this is the critical boundary that distributed assets are trying to cross, which is how do we take the benefit of smaller assets that are faster to build, faster to permit, faster to interconnect, and ultimately ensure that through data quality and dispatch visibility and dedication to grid operations, those assets can also provide the critical unlock of additional capacity to grow large loads and an overall load. So in a world where the grid puts batteries and distributed gas everywhere, the effect is improved grid utilization or system utilization. And the reason is pretty simple. There are several ways to do it, as you can see on the slide from a shape standpoint, but it all amounts to having assets that can charge or dispatch when there's plenty, right? Batteries, I often say, are electron time machines. They have a superpower, which is they can charge up when there's plenty of space on the grid, which was built to peak, and then dispatch on those peaks to relieve stress and improve total utilization. The effect in both cases of having more energized, dispatchable, grid-dedicated assets on the distribution and transmission system is ultimately that you can sell more total electrons over those same wires and benefit from an affordability standpoint from a denominator effect where the cost of those fixed infrastructure investments of wires and infrastructure are divided over more power sold, which is actually the largest mathematical input into the price of power. And we think we found what we think of as sort of a missing middle, where, obviously utility scale batteries and utility scale generation have enormous efficiencies and cost efficiencies of scale. It's how the grid really was built, which is, that kind of centralized solution sent over wires. But as the grid grows and as grid utilization, affordability, reliability, and rapid load growth really push grid operators and customers to pick up new tools of capacity growth, and at the same time, the technology, as you've heard today, is improving across companies like the one represented on the phone here, but also just the basic cost dynamics of batteries and gensets getting pretty darn cheap. There is this missing middle or sweet spot where, in this kind of 1 to 5 megawatt range, you have assets that are big enough to capture the cost effectiveness of larger utility scale assets. They're only a little bit more expensive, but they have substantially more grid value because you can target them exactly and locationally where the grid needs them and really maximize that impact on grid utilization, putting downward pressure on rates, while also supporting reliability, because the more assets you have all over the grid, while it adds complexity in grid operations, it ultimately provides a lot of reliability to weather events, to wildfire impacts, and other stressors. But those assets also have to meet a critical test. As I mentioned, about customer aggregated assets, you can absolutely have a behind the meter asset provide value to the grid. And think of traditional demand response. You're paying someone to use their asset for part of the time to relieve general stress. But if we really want these assets to be critical grid infrastructure, and I think that's one of the themes you're hearing today, is these assets and this asset category is really crossing from a sort of program or customer participation solution into core reliable grid infrastructure because of the technological progress and price reductions. So the way we have to think about distributed capacity is it has to become a part of core system planning. We have to plan the grid with these assets in mind on that basis. They have to be big, fast, predictable, and cheap, sort of how I frame it. Right? It has to be hundreds of megawatts deployed in relevant geographies to the growth, and those deployments have to be predictable, and they also have to be verifiable and dispatchable, which ties back to the point about SCADA connected telemetry and data quality. If a grid operator can't see them with a certain type of fast response telemetry, right, 5 to 15-second understanding of thermal and amperage and voltage impact, it's very difficult to truly believe that these megawatts are providing impacts that are ultimately physics anchored. And to power a data center, we also have to make sure that the wires and transformers and grid equipment along the way don't melt.
Right.
And I think collectively, last simple point, throughout all these presentations, distributed capacity is on the list of grid growth. There are a bunch of big solutions that are coming to bear to grow the grid and get this job done. But distributed capacity, I think, is now firmly on that list of major contributors to cost-effective grid growth.
Excellent. Thank you, Pier. Thank you. Very clear indeed. So just before we proceed to the discussion, I just want to remind everyone, but these slides will be available on our site afterwards. So there's a lot of data there, valuable stuff. So they will be made available. Okay, well, I guess to start the conversation, it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out where we start, but maybe a general question is, what do we see as the big challenges facing the grid and how decentralization helps? And just maybe kind of in just a couple of points from your perspective. So maybe if I go around the table, maybe start with you, Haroon. What do you see as the kind of big issue and how decentralization from your perspective is helping that process?
I think the centralized grid model, right, that was pioneered 100 plus years ago, has its limits. It has its benefits, and yet it has its limits. It's very difficult to add a gigawatt of capacity, which is what a single data center may need going forward. So the best way to start adding decentralized grid enhancements is for data centers. They are looking at gigawatt plus per site, 100 megawatt, gigawatt, multi-gigawatt. And natural gas is the best way to augment the grid. And I think that's where it's a very defined market. It's a very defined set of people that'll do the job for growing the market. In addition, I think you have to manage the AI load fluctuations. You have to manage any of the building fluctuations while making sure that the distributed generation assets like turbines and grid only see the steady or slowly changing power flow. So that's how I think it's the best penetration for bringing a decentralized grid, and following that AI data center model will be electrification, which grows a little bit more slowly, but it's also a massive market with global reach. So that's I think the growth path.
Yeah, I think maybe Matthew or Julian or Pier, do you have any specific thoughts to follow on from Haroon on that?
Maybe just building on what Haroon said. I mean, data centers certainly an area where a lot of innovation can happen, right? It's where AI is coming from, but at the infrastructure level, there's opportunities for innovation as well. And we can certainly make sure that they're a good citizen on the grid. One of the things that I'd say is when we look at the overall power system, data center load growth is absolutely enormous, but at the moment, still only a few percent of the overall grid. And so it's not just data centers. This is not a challenge that's arising now that we're doing data centers. It's something that, in the dark corners of power systems, we've all been talking about for 10, 15, 20 years of when is this challenge going to come? And first it was renewables coming in, causing challenges within the system. Then the way that we're using energy was fundamentally changing, and now data centers is causing a huge challenge for us. But the overall at the entirety of the energy system, it's still the same thing. We still want efficient, reliable energy. And it's getting to a point of, for the grid, how do you keep the lights on? And I think there's been a really good mix in the company presentations today on different ways to do that. But it needs to be, at the end of the day, the poor old utility is stuck there owning a huge amount of infrastructure. Electricity grid, biggest man-made machine ever built. They have to keep the lights on, and all of us are trying to connect things to their system, making their job much harder. So they've got this big challenge ahead of them that they can't solve with just a software patch. They can't just, build infinitely more wires and transformers and switchgear. They need a smarter way to do it. And that's going to come from across the whole ecosystem. Data centers will be part of it. Prosumers will be part of it. Better grid management is going to be a critical part as well. So we need to make sure that all of these things happen in parallel and that they all operate together properly. Because if we optimize in one location, but it doesn't work with anything else, then fundamentally the system's still going to be broken.
Yeah. More specifically, if we drill down towards the data center point that you mentioned, Matthew, maybe let me turn to Julian. What specifically had data centers kind of created a pressure point on the grid that I think it's bringing it to the fore? Because it was a problem that was growing, but I think recently data centers have made it a very kind of urgent point. And I don't know if you'd care to share some thoughts on that.
Yes. So maybe one consequence, it haven't had nothing to do with the data center, but what we witnessed in Spain, right? With this blackout, what happens when you don't prepare your grid for energy transition? Now, considering more or less all societies are going through an energy transition, some with earlier targets, some with a bit later targets. But if you're now adding data center to this energy transition, then a case like in Spain becomes more likely. And data centers with their extreme power profiles, so having those extreme peaks to the upper limits, they can gain a lot if you're making them more efficient. There are several ways or solutions they're investigating to make them more efficient. One is, of course, also through supercapacitors. So you can do it directly on the route in the data center to increase efficiency, or you do it at a later stage on the high voltage grid side to take care of the fluctuations on that level. Or in the other direction, what we also see now on the market is that the grids are saying, dear data center, you cannot disconnect so easily like you like in case I have some issue. So they're implementing measures like fault right through. So where the data center also needs to prepare to be able to cover any power quality issues coming from the grid side, so from the other direction. So they are also interdependent from each other or becoming more interdependent from each other over time. And I think their efficiency plays a big role, reducing the grid connection points, also then for the data center itself, being able to connect earlier to grid connections. All those topics are becoming more and more relevant. At least this is what we are, let's say, witnessing all the time.
Agreed. Any kind of reactions to that, Haroon, Matthew, or Pier?
I think the fundamental problem that supercapacitors are going to solve for data centers is that when the GPU servers, when you need multiple hundreds to thousands of GPU servers aligned in a learning engine cycle, you get a massive surge that goes from, say, a megawatt to 2 megawatts, and for hundreds of these servers, you're going to have a massive fluctuation 4 times a second. Every generator that has powered such a source, such a load, it's ripped off the generator shaft. Every battery chemistry has failed prematurely, except a couple of new ones. Supercapacitors are the answer to kill those peaks and absorb hundreds of millions of cycles over 2, 3 years. It's a massive problem. And I think that's where I see technologies like Skeleton really helping, along with multi-port SSTs, to alleviate that. The second thing that I think on data centers that'll be very key is the overall multi-hour peak in power that'll occur. And for data centers, what you have to do is absorb that peak as much as you can behind the meter with storage. The reason is, if you don't, you can only take a fraction of the available power from the grid. So you will have stranded power on the grid. If you have stranded power on the grid, a megawatt of power generates $10 to $12 million of revenue a year. So if you have 10 megawatts of stranded power, 10%, which is small, you're going to have $120 million less revenue. So really, the AI data center problem is not just the peaks, it's also the longer duration energy storage, or medium duration and longer duration solved by batteries. And then ultimately you have to have some form of generation to provide augmented energy. So I think that's the multiplicity of time scale problems to solve in the data center. Hope that helps.
A lot. I see a couple of you shaking your heads. Pier, any reaction to that?
Absolutely. I think we're really just all learning so fast in terms of how the interoperability and intersection of those timescales, right? And I liked how you frame that of, you're really solving a range of problems at a range of scales. And it's dizzying to think about, you have on-site power that is not just as simple as adding megawatts. It has all the complexities that Haroon just described in terms of how it interacts with both the grid and on-site needs. But I think that the work that we're doing with distributed capacity procurement is really taking that broader grid approach. If you think about how data centers have gotten cited in this kind of infrastructure conversation, the first task is to find where the grid had excess headroom and stick a data center there. The second lever we are now actively pulling at scale and has all the opportunity and complexity that Haroon's pointing out is the on-site power, the power electronics and capacitors necessary to make those data centers most effectively fit in that space and find the most available spaces that fit. And then the third lever is really that off-site capacity, which is filling in the gaps of the grid to make more headroom to begin with. And in some ways, that third lever kind of loops back to the first. So I think that despite all the complexity underneath, you're really seeing, I think, the conversation settle around those three basic gears. How much does the grid have to offer? How can you improve the fit of on-site centers to the grid? And then how can you grow the grid to create more headroom?
Thank you. Let me turn to a slightly different question now for Matt and for Julian, which is really how are young startup companies, addressing supply chain issues, whilst we got rising demand, whether this is capacity or even supply chain issues due to kind of geography or geopolitics. Maybe start with you, Julian.
Yes, good point. Especially considering that at least when we're thinking about lithium-ion battery, right, there is a very strong geopolitical focus on China, for example. Skeleton has the approach to be geopolitically completely independent. Completely independent is also relative, right? So we are based in the European Union, in Germany. So our philosophy is that we can source all critical components out of the European Union. That's also why we are doing or developing our own raw material, or producing our own raw material, cells, modules, racks. This is, let's say, how we solved it. Other than that, of course, it's affecting like geopolitical issues, but more on the export side, considering any tariffs coming. But for us, we have solved it that way, that we are fully relying on a EU-based value chain. Looking into expansion in the US, there will be then either a US focused value chain or like an interplay with Europe. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I don't know, Matthew, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, everyone always wants to know about transformer supply chains because we work with existing OEMs. We've taken this approach because if you say that, supply and demand is the challenge, we need to build out more factories, that takes years and hundreds of millions, if not billions, to do, and that needs to be done in parallel. If you agree that the demand is not going away, which very much looks like it's the case, but doesn't help solve the problem today. So, transformers famously are quoted of having 3, 4, 5 year lead time. If you need to build the transmission, like 500 megawatt size transformer, there's only a couple of factories in the world that do that. And they're on very long lead times. But the transformers that grid utilities and data centers and everyone else using are much smaller than that. And so we're working with partners, there's hundreds of gigawatts of supply chain availability at 4, 5, 6 month lead time. And so we've taken an approach of repurposing those supply chains. So rather than building old dumb transformers, they can work with us and build our advanced ones. And that's really how we've been able to work across multiple geographies so quickly, is by repurposing the existing supply chain.
No, thanks, Matthew. I was just on mute because no, we agree. We believe that places like or sectors like transformers, which have been largely taken for granted and overlooked, actually are presenting some very interesting investment opportunities going forward.
Quick comment on that. I think something that's been very clear in our work is transformers are also bigger categories. And maybe the theme of all of our 6 months is like, when you talk about these categories, it often then becomes like, okay, well, what type of transformers, as an example? And one of the other superpowers we think that distributed smaller assets have, if you can get them to that right kind of middle scale, is that they can use the cheaper, more available transformers that are not the high voltage transformers, right? So when we talk about transformer constraints through substations, data centers, and transmission, mostly, I think, and certainly, I think Matthew, or you know much more about this than I do, so confirm this, but my understanding is that high voltage supply chain is very different from and much more constrained and competitive than the broader transformer. So when we're connecting a 3 megawatt battery on a distribution feeder, we're using low voltage traditional transformers that we've had no issue in getting and ordering.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that high to medium voltage ones that are hundreds of megawatts in size, because there's only a couple of people, the Hitachis, the Siemens of the world that build that. Everyone else on the planet, whether you're a utility or you're a large industrial data center, it's generally sub 5 MVA in capacity.
Right.
And that supply chain is continuing to grow quite rapidly. If we'll go away and Google, there's hundreds of millions of factory upgrades that are being announced by everyone, but it's also a lot more distributed in terms of who you can buy from. So if you're on East Coast versus West Coast, there's different people. There's still some global players, but a big chunk of the market, there's hundreds of transformer suppliers out there.
And while this is a really detailed point, I think this is actually a really important reflection of why this whole distributed conversation is happening, is that the supply chain is an opportunity to bring all of that to bear to grow the grid in aggregate has fewer friction points than the concentrated, get me a 200 megawatt transformer. Actually, I need 4 of them for my one substation for my new data center, right? They're 2 different tasks.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I agree with these excellent points. The medium to low voltage transformers are not as constrained or constrained like the high voltage to medium voltage. In addition, switchgear, UPSs, power electronics have a multi-year wait time now, as all the incumbents are pretty much sold out. So we have engineered our supply chain to deliver first orders in 6 months and volume orders in under 3 months. We know right down to the component who are the approved vendors, and we have worked with the part selection that way. Plus, we eliminate so many different parts. That's why our lead time is way down, as we showed on our slides. The best thing, though, that I think we bring to the table is we eliminate an interconnection study, because in our solution, you don't couple to the grid. You don't need an inverter to couple solar or battery to the grid. And by eliminating an interconnection study, you take that 2 to 4 year queue for those studies down to 4 to 6 weeks for permitting, which I think is very important if you want to scale fast. And so it is a supply chain thing. It's also making sure you're going to be an excellent friend to the grid and help the grid when they are ready, not before. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you. I think there's a pretty broad agreement there, but underlying it all from a banker's point of view, there's a lot of investment opportunity there because we've got a real supply chain pressure, right? Because I think from what we're hearing is that the lives of transformers and other equipment is actually become shorter because of the kind of the power curves that one is seeing from data centers. So we've taken a lot of these things for granted, but there will be a growing market for that. Maybe before we move on, just a question for Pier. What are kind of, from your perspective, we talked about unutilized capacity in the grid, and I know that's something that's kind of dear to the heart of Sparkfund. Maybe briefly kind of talk us through some of the innovations there.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think grid utilization is really having a moment, both in terms of industry narrative, its implications for what technologies, supply chains, and approaches deliver it, its effect in terms of affordability, downward pressure on rates, and reliability. But it's also having a really exciting moment from a policy standpoint. So Sparkfund was very proud to be one of the co-founding companies involved in what's called the Utilized Coalition, which is a new coalition of corporates in this space dedicated entirely to promoting grid utilization and grid utilization enhancing standards and technology. And so what the Utilized Coalition does is it works with governors and legislatures and regulators and utilities and communities of technology providers to help clarify the point that, if you get grid utilization right, what that really means in practice is sell more over the grid you have, get more power out of the grid we've already paid for, divide those costs over more electrons sold, win the future with AI, the cloud, awesome new cars, general electrification, and make power cheaper and the grid more reliable along the way, which is I think a really compelling and kind of simplified view of what all this adds up to, right? All these details. And so the Utilized Coalition was formed just last year. We came out of the gate. We have some really exciting members: Google, Tesla, Carrier, large HVAC corporation and their energy division, who are doing embedded batteries and HVAC. Span doing smart panels, Renew Home with distributed BPP capacity, thermostat dispatch, Sparkfund, and Veris is a flexible data center operator. So really exciting coalition of corporates and collaborating with a broader group than that. And we were able to work with Governor Abigail Spanberger in Virginia to put grid utilization on the top line of her affordability agenda for the grid. It's a critical issue in that gubernatorial race. And worked with her and her team and a bipartisan group of state legislatures in Virginia and Dominion as the leading utility to shape the first in the nation grid utilization legislation that passed and was signed into law by Governor Stan Bamberger with the support of the utility operator. And one last key point on grid utilization standards themselves, they're really making the point, actually, that regulators and utilities with a flourishing technology community coming to bring these solutions like the ones represented on the call can actually get this job done inside the existing system. You can create metrics that measure how much we're getting out of the grid, and inside the existing utility incentive and regulatory system deliver this outcome. You just need to set that direction from a normative standpoint.
Great. So it is possible. Great. I'd like to turn the conversation to the role of the end user and invite Alex to ask a few questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I guess to kick things off, we've been hearing a lot about the role of data centers. What do they have to play? I guess when it comes to Matt and Pierre, but how do you see the line blurring between front and behind the meter in terms of, in our conversations, it's been a lot of interesting definitions, ultimately coalescing towards, are the assets pure grid focus, or do you actually have to balance responsibilities?
Matt, you go first.
Me go first? Okay. We're both too polite. So I think what's interesting as an engineer by background, from a physics perspective, this kind of is it in front of the meter, behind the meter is all about like who's paying for it, who owns it. And I guess this is one of the reasons why traditionally utilities have had to do so many power studies. Every time anyone wants to come along and change things, they have to check, even if it's behind the meter. So the factory or the data center is a black box. It doesn't matter what they're doing inside. It impacts everything else that's connected in that local area and kind of expands the impact beyond that. So when we start looking at should we be doing things in front or behind the meter, it probably needs to be a mix of both, right? So there's trade-offs like anything. In some ways, correcting power flows or reactive power or harmonics or really detailed things closer to the load can unlock a lot of benefits. But then at the other end, you can go, well, if you centralize everything, you've got these efficiencies of scale that can be unlocked. But I think more and more we're seeing a trend to behind the meter, a decentralized approach, I think someone mentioned earlier, even at the data center level, right? Moving to smaller distributed data centers, not just from a compute perspective, but from a power perspective. And I think that if we get that right, that's really going to allow everything to move faster. And Pierre, I'm sure you'll be able to speak on this. I think regulation markets is going to be a really key area because there's lots of technology, some of it really old, some of it new and innovative that can come in and solve problems. And we're now seeing utilities that are announcing budgets of tens of billions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever, for grid upgrades over the next couple of years. And we need to make sure that we invest in the right technology that solves problems today, but also into the future. But the regulation, not just the technical regulations, but the markets that these technologies can play in, don't artificially limit or incentivize the wrong type of technologies or behaviors.
Yeah, we're an industry I think that's really well framed, Matthew. And we're an industry that really loves our sort of fiat boundaries and taxonomies and acronyms. I sometimes say that we all live in the TLA forest, the three-letter acronym forest. And you have this habit of saying, oh, BTM, FTM, in transmission grid, distribution grid. And in some ways, those boundaries matter, right? Who pays for it, who uses it, who gets the contractual benefit. But what I think is becoming clear, right? Nothing like the largest capital and infrastructure cycle in our lifetimes and or human history to really start to push on some of those learned habits and boundaries and acronyms. And what does that really mean? Well, could we get more from this side or this side? And I think, one elaboration of your comment is it's regulatory, it's economic and market, but it's also just institutional systems, like how human systems have been set up inside regulators, grid operators, and companies to sell or discern what's a BTM solution. Is that a customer program that lives in a different part of the utility? Is FTM done by distribution operations? Do those teams talk to each other? How do you engage this as a sort of serious planning task? And the last thing I'll say is why we think it's so important that this goes into the heart of grid planning is so you can start to test and dissolve those boundaries to the extent possible, right? You want to look at this starting with the outcome that you want to deliver for the grid and society, grid utilization being one, but not the only on that list of kind of higher level outcomes. If you go up a scope and say, what do we want this technology to do? You can back test it on which of the technology is cheap enough, which of it's reliable and proven enough, which of it does the job at a physics level that we say it does, and then where might we put that technology to deliver that higher level outcome. And I think that's a systems thinking and outcome oriented shift in response to one of the most dramatic and exciting kind of capital infrastructure and economic cycles in decades.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, when we first started looking at, in terms of you'd think, oh, the decentralized grid is that only actually going to be behind the meter? Is it only pure consumer focused? But I mean, especially in our conversations with you, no, actually front of meter has a huge role to play as well. It's not just it's going to all be microgrid with the consumer end. You actually need to work with utilities. You need this comprehensive approach.
I'd also point out that when you say behind the meter, right, and it's appropriate to say that a lot of the on-site energy of a data center is behind the meter. That's a perfectly appropriate way to think about it, and it implies some of the power electronics, capacitor, UPS stuff that Haroon was speaking about so precisely, right, and that is all over this conversation. But like calling that behind the meter, I mean, those data centers are the sizes of like major metro areas. Right? Like, you could call that front of the meter for like a whole freaking town. Right? So yes, it's behind the meter. Sure. UPS, got it. There are real reasons to talk about it that way. I'm not trying to say there aren't, but like which meter, right? Is this one building the size of like Detroit? Like from a power perspective? So, I mean, I don't know if that's a helpful comment or not, but at least it's pretty amazing what we're starting to.
Yeah, it's a good way to rethink it. I mean, when you think about when the US, was starting to build out its electrical grid, compare a modern data center against, some of the initial installations that utilities were putting down, it's a bit humbling in that aspect.
Right. We've never discussed behind the meter solutions at that gigawatt power flow, multi-second variation, right? I call this the Princess Bride problem, right? You keep using that word, but we're all learning fast.
Indeed. Very good. Well, I guess talking, on the data center point as, but the line continues to blur. But I guess when it comes to Haroon and Matt, why do you see data centers being so incentivized to build their own power? And what role do they have to play in the decentralized grid? I mean, you two are very, key in working with data center clients as well. So keen to hear your perspective.
Yeah, would you like to go first? I want to be the polite one too. So
everyone wants to be polite. No, it's my turn to be polite. You're up first, Haroon.
Thank you. So data centers, right? AI, it's a massive amount of money behind it. The balance sheets of the hyperscalers alone, whether you look at Google, Meta, Microsoft, Oracle now, anybody, and even the startups like OpenAI and Anthropic approaching those sort of levels of investment, they've got massive amounts of money to deploy. The blue chips definitely do. And their balance sheets are creating a very strong and focused money pool, whether they're backing up neoclouds, whether they're taking offtake from data center developers and neoclouds, it doesn't matter. There's a huge concentrated pool. They have an urgency, and what's driving that urgency is the fact that let's say global GDP is 100 trillion, 20% is services. It's displacing that 20 trillion of GDP of services or augmenting it through AI. Electricity goes in and these services come out. So and they're scared that they're going to lose their leads. So now you have concentrated huge amount of money. You've got a very defined use case, and you've got people that are going to move at 50 to 100x the speed of a utility. I think that's where some of these terms come in. I've sold to utilities for 10, 20 years. Hopefully it'll change in the near future, but I think when you have something that's very concentrated with a strong revenue need and demand that is exceeding supply right now, that's what creates the urgency and probably the most massive market for power we've ever seen in terms of growth in the last 100 years. And I think those dynamics are extremely compelling, backed up by that fast-moving investment.
Yeah,
Agreed.
great point, Haroon. I think, I mean, building on that, you said it's kind of you're turning electrons into compute and services. And you mentioned earlier, 1 megawatt is around 10 million in revenue. I mean, that rate of return on electrons to services is absolutely enormous. So it's all about trying to build out quicker and capture that market. And if the grid connection is slow, right, they can generate the power behind the meter themselves, as we're starting to see. I think, Alex, you had a slide that was saying, it's only 500 million, to build the generation, which sounds like a big number to all of us regular people, but is almost ending up being a rounding error for them in these big projects. One of the other things that we're starting to see being spoken about more is, in the future, can data centers manage workloads to try and act as part of this decentralized load response? And there's some early trials in this space. I'm sure some of us have read about them. I wonder whether the economics are going to stack up for these big players, though, because we've just pointed out how much money they can make from the power. When you start going, okay, are we going to manage workloads? Are we going to do demand turn down? Are we going to shift workloads? These sorts of things. What impact's that going to have on their compute revenue? What level of hardware utilization are they going to be able to achieve on this, billions of dollars of infrastructure? And then if they're not making as much money per, unit of data center that they've built, how's that going to impact the cost of AI that we as the end user are all paying for these tokens? So I think we need to be really careful because they're spending trillions of dollars doing all this stuff. But at some point in time, they're going to need to make all that money back, and the consumer's going to be the one that ends up paying for it.
It's so important not to lose. Oh, sorry,
Sorry, please go ahead. No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So important not to lose sight of that context of what energy in the grid has been for in our society, right? And particularly in America, it's so important to say out loud. We have had decades, 100 years of the most dynamic industrial and service and technological economy in the world, powered by all the electricity that we can use in every application, right? Our grid is enormous, it's reliable, it's relatively cheap, and none of our economic activities and aspirations as a nation have been constrained by electric infrastructure. So there is this sort of choice that we sit today with this huge shift in how much an electron is worth when turned into a token, right? And Brian Janis is, Cleverleaf has spoken eloquently about this as the bit-watt spread, right? To give a framework to this part of the conversation, that 1 to 10 enumeration you brought, Haroon. But I think that the just stepping back and saying, look, our goal as a society should be to have abundant, sufficient energy. We should build American infrastructure to meet this moment, to capture the value of these technologies for our economy, for our towns, the tax revenue, the jobs, the economic impact. That is an abundance mindset. And I think it shifts the tone and shifts the context of how we evaluate these solutions as we go about the conversation. So I think it's something that, is important for us all to keep in mind of what is energy for in its historic context.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from our shareholder perspective, and to us, are the tokens subsidized today? Is the cost of tokens subsidized today? More than likely. And we have become an AI native company, so we're putting in AI everywhere, and we're looking at the economics of how much do we pay for tokens, what services do these displace, and what happens if the cost of tokens goes up 10x. I'll give you an example. It used to take us 3 hours to design a mechanical part. We have created agentic AI with our own internal agentic team of agentic AI team of about 15 people. Today, what took 3 hours takes 5 seconds. And that data is fed directly to machines. And we are doing mechanical engineering parts now with these automatic multi-axis machines to gouge them out and then put them into test bays. We are glad to pay 10x to 100x for a token because the value to us to do high-speed innovation where mechanical engineering is done at the speed of software is immense. So obviously we're getting benefits from subsidized tokens, but there will exist, I believe, a huge amount of use cases in which people will be willing to pay much more. and there will be additional price segmentation for tokens coming from how you probably use it as these guys try to figure out how to make a huge amount of money in the very near future.
I think that's a solid point. I mean, ultimately, all these companies, they're not charities. They're ultimately trying to make a profit at the end of the day,
Yep.
but it's always good to see, that the market scaling up in that regard.
It is, and there's a tsunami coming, right? And it's going to displace a lot of folks, and so the best way to ride that tsunami is learn to use AI and become an AI native company. So you're the one of the ones that can really benefit from it.
Yeah. I guess shifting to a related but different topic, how do you all see how the decentralized grid has evolved, and where do we need innovation? For example, during our conversations, one area that we feel is overlooked is actually transmission and distribution. Generation has seen a lot of love, but it feels like, there's a lot of scope to actually innovate around the T&D network.
Maybe I'll start with a frame, which is that, as this capital cycle has come to light and load growth has come back, the utility and regulatory system and all the parts of its value chain, which we are, right, on this call, have rapidly shifted to a new world, which is load growth changes every calculation downstream of what you can invest where and why, right? And one simple example of that is, utilities have looked at their distribution systems largely as a cost center, right? They have aging distribution circuits that have been hard to replace for affordability reasons. And to keep power cheap, we've had to defer a lot of maintenance. So distribution grid has both been an input into rate increase, but also a constant battle of budgets of which transformer do you upgrade, why, how can you, evaluate the safety. And now in this world, the distribution grid is all of a sudden a strategic partner for capacity growth. You can actually both upgrade it and make it more reliable and get more out of it to do the job, right? So that sort of mindset shift, I think, is happening all across the regulatory, the grid operator, and the value chain of really trying to see how this infrastructure platform that was built to peak, had a lot of excess underneath it for many hours a year, can actually meet this moment if you invest in it in the right ways.
For sure. And Julian, your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe adding here an example actually from my home country in Germany. So where the grid evolved a lot over the last decades, coming from a lot of rotating mass nuclear power, making decision of nuclear power exit, no coal anymore, just a few gas power plants and a lot of renewables, plus a lot of residential generation as well, where we see that also there, the TSO, I just met yesterday one of the German TSOs, and they actually decided to completely move away from synchronous condensers and 100% go with eStatCom. So again, like an inverter-based solution, since they consider that as a more modern, more efficient solution compared to a lot of technology that has a lot of losses, but it's of course like a well tradition and very well known solution, the synchronous condensers. But they are preparing themselves for much more flexibility in the grid and much more fragmented power generation. And this is also what the technology around is preparing. And Germany is now one example, right? But again, if you consider European Union, but also other societies, all of them are slowly taking similar journeys, a bit putting at the side the concept of fusion power generation, which is also a very exciting topic. But also this is something actually where supercaps can support as well.
One thing I just want to offer, there are very, very smart people in this world, including my colleagues here, and they're doing tremendous innovation. I think the real innovation has to happen where in the utility mindset, which takes too many years to qualify amazing new technologies. However that's done, whether it's done in a large centralized test bed that may cost $500 million to $1 billion, but it qualifies for all utilities and say at a national or European Union scale, that's absolutely essential. The technologies are there. I'm sure there are some gaps in things that come out of startups as people need time to mature. But if you have a national test bed and an adoption policy on utilities to absorb the decentralized grid and add it to their centralized model, I think that's how you're going to get to the fastest form of energy addition and probably a far lower and balanced levelized cost of energy.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well
it
said.
doesn't matter this behind the meter, front of the meter. I agree with Pier. It
Yeah, well
doesn't
said.
matter. What matters is it's decentralized and it's all over. And the utility mindset changes from, I'm going to control my monopoly, which has been the model for 100 years, to, hey, let's make sure it benefits my shareholders, but also it benefits the consumer in a big way.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to wrap that together. I sometimes find it funny that people think that, the utility incentive is broken, right? Everything we're talking about is them spending more money to deliver more power to more people in a growing economy. And
Yep.
the things they'll invest in are different. It'll be supercapacitors and transformers and batteries and gensets and, still more gas plants and more transmission, right? We're going to need more of all of it. I don't think the incentive model is broken, but I do agree. I think you spoke very precisely to the ways in which the mindset, the organization, that outcome focus, how they evaluate those new investments, that needs to change. There is change needed, but I've often thought we've been sort of blurrily thinking about, like it's sort of fashionable to say like, well, the utility incentive, they have an incentive to spend capital. It's like, yes, to build American infrastructure to power an economy and deliver this result is like actually not that bad of an incentive from my perspective, but how they pursue that incentive, I think you've got those comments.
And just as a big shout out, because the power has been on throughout this webinar, right? We got to thank the utilities.
It does
So
work.
they don't think we're attacking them and they don't take
Right.
contracts out on our heads, right? We respect them a lot. They are our friends, and we're just making suggestions to grow. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the things actually is the framework as well. In our discussions, there's been an interesting parallel against the healthcare industry. Both utilities and healthcare are very conservative, but healthcare actually has a standardization across the framework. Say, okay, is the device certified to this level? Okay, all healthcare industry can use it. But every utility is its own beast. They have their own frameworks which constrains them on how quick to act. So I think that's a solid point of if they could all speak the same language, you could actually see much faster adoption. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
Healthcare, a market totally absent of bad incentives and difficult economics. All right, good.
Wonderful. Well, I guess as we wrap up here, we've heard a ton of wonderful insights. I guess to close it out, we'd love to hear some closing thoughts from each of you. So I guess maybe if we start with Haroon.
Well, I think that I want to thank the panel. I think we are looking at a massive pipeline for the next 3 years. I'm not sure how we're going to scale up that fast, but there's a lot of smart people helping us out from major CMs to whatnot. And we hope to add the same value to the electrification world as well as the AI data center world. Thank you.
Perfect. And next, Matt.
Thank you to everyone on here today. I found a really interesting conversation that despite the companies coming from different kind of technologies and backgrounds, that this system level overview and there seemed to be quite good agreement on a lot of topics across from everyone. There's certainly no doubt that we've moved from 10 years ago, the question was, is there going to be a problem in grids, in power? And even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, it was, okay, when's there going to be the problem? And we're now seeing that the problem is now Spain. Last summer was a great example of that. So it's going to be a massive mix of technologies, of hardware, of different types of software coming in. But energy is a primary input into everything. So it's really important. And quickly on the build out of the grid, we're having to increase it, but the 50% of the EU grid, because I'm sitting in Europe, is reaching end of life in the next 3.5 years. So there's certainly, even without data centers, there's certainly lots of work to be done.
For sure. Ironically, in our last webinar, we were showcasing resiliency, and I think European and North American grids, the average age is 40 years. So spot on that, we also do need to actually leverage our existing grids a lot more. Perfect. And Julian?
Yeah, from my side, just a very short one. Actually, it's when I started 15 years ago in the energy sector, working across several segments. I would have never thought how cool this industry would have become 15 years later. So also thanks to everyone here. It was actually great also to see how we all fit somehow into this big solution of solving at least a part of the big problem. And yeah, I think there will be good potential of collaboration also between us guys here.
Solid. And finally, Pier.
Well, what's to that point, Julian, what's so exciting about, I think, the flow of these industrial conversations is we have these big barriers that sometimes seem impossible and are so easy to talk about as intractable problems. And it's exactly because companies like ours all end up somewhat invisibly swarming those problems, coming up with ideas, reframing, right? Utility organizations do change how they talk about and evaluate technology. Regulators do adopt this signal. Governors engage and pass laws, right? People are working on this problem that is now exciting and central and fun and intellectually engaging, precisely because it is, I think, the fundamental input to a whole chapter of the next, kind of 100 years of human flourishing in our economy, right? Electrons and electrostates are going to be some of the fundamental inputs to economic competition, to geopolitical competition, and ultimately to military competition, right? Electrons, we talk about AI and cloud and manufacturing and cars and stoves, right? I think for better and worse, in 2045, we'll be talking about electrons to power drones and autonomous mass as a critical extension of military strategy, right? So electrons are going to sit at the absolute heart of much of the next 100 years of human experience, and it's an honor to be a part of that. And I think keeping that societal perspective helps us both engage seriously with the details, the acronyms, the engineering, the physics, but also remember what the purpose is in this work and why it's so exciting to be a part of it. So it's a wonderful conversation. Thank you for including us.
No problem. I mean, we've really enjoyed our insights, that we've all heard today. And as a point, we will be sharing the full recording and the slides after this as well. So we're keen to share this across, and thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you
a
all.
lot.
Thank you.
Bye.